Good afternoon. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today, those of you who are joining us on the Zoom webinar and those of you who are joining us on YouTube as well. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and I'm joined today by my colleague Elise Giuliano from the Harriman Institute at Columbia. This is the New York City Russia Public Policy Seminar series that we've been running now. I think this is our 8th year of running this. It's a joint endeavor between New York University's Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and the Harriman Institute at Columbia. We are generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who provided funding for many years for this program. We used to be in person. We moved online during the pandemic, and we've stayed online ever since. This is the start of our 2024-2025 programming, and it couldn't come at a more opportune time. Today, we're going to be talking about perspectives on the 2024 Georgian elections, and in particular focusing in on understanding Russian influence on the Georgian elections. We're joined by a fantastic set of panelists who Elise will be introducing in turn. We'll also be putting more information about each of the panelists in the chat for those of you who are joining us on the Zoom webinar. For those of you who are on YouTube, you can go to either the Jordan Center or the Harriman Institute page for this event and find more about our panelists as well. I wanted to just give everyone a brief sense of how the event is going to unfold for those of you who may not joined one of the New York City Russia Public Policy series before. We've asked each of our panelists to prepare introductory remarks around 12 minutes or so. So most of the first hour will be remarks from our panelists in turn. That will then leave us about a half an hour for a follow-up discussion. Elise and I will pose some questions to them, but we'd like to invite questions from you, our audience, as well. You'll notice if you're on the Zoom webinar, there's a Q&A button. You should just leave your questions in the Q&A, and then Elise and I will be able to see them and pose them to the panelists. If you're on YouTube, you can use the chat on YouTube, although that's always can be, the chat is public, just everyone should be aware of that. But we will also be keeping an eye on the YouTube chat to see if there are questions that are coming in from there. Because of the webinar format, there's no way for us to release you to actually speak. So put the details in your question, and then we'll pose them to the panelists. We'll wrap up by 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. We realize everyone's time is incredibly valuable. We thank you so much for joining us here today, but we will be done by 1:30 p.m. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host, Elise Giuliano from Columbia University. Elise?
Thank you, Josh. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. The first speaker on today's panel will be Joshua Kucera. Joshua is a journalist based in Tbilisi. He currently covers the Caucasus region for RFE/RL and The Economist. Before that, from 2016 to 2022, he was the Turkey Caucasus editor at EurasiaNet, and he's published numerous articles in leading outlets, including an op-ed in today's New York Times. Our next speaker will be Ambassador Natalie Sabanadze. She is Senior Research Fellow, Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. Prior to this, she served as head of the Georgian mission to the EU and ambassador plenipotentiary to the Kingdom of Belgium and Grand Duchy of Luxembourg since 2013. Before that, she worked as a senior official at the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities in The Hague. Our following speaker will be Georgi Kandilaki. He served as a member of the Georgian Parliament from 2008 to 2020, and he is now project manager at the Soviet Past Research Laboratory, or SovLab, a leading Georgian think tank dedicated to investigating Georgia's Soviet totalitarian history and countering its weaponization by Russian disinformation efforts. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that when he speaks today. And our final speaker today will be Professor Julie George. Julie is associate professor at Queens College, CUNY, and associate adjunct professor at Harriman Institute, Columbia University. She specializes in comparative and international politics with a focus on ethnicity, identity, conflict, and state building, and she's published numerous books and many articles in leading peer-reviewed journals. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our speakers. Joshua?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. There's so many important angles to this election and so many moving parts in what is really a very complex internal and external machine. So it's hard to know where to start on this, but I wanted to maybe start with one of the questions that you posed in the introduction to the panel, which is the idea that this is a referendum on Europe versus Russia. This is something that you hear very often in international media coverage of Georgian politics, and of course, within Georgia itself. I think, though, that it's a misframing of the situation here and the stakes of these elections, and a misunderstanding that could, I think, lead to misinterpretations of whatever result we see on Saturday. So I'm going to make a few brief points about that. So in the framing of Russia versus Europe, it's not the Europe part that I take an issue with, it's the Russia part. It's clear that Georgian Dream is trying to move Georgia away from Europe. We see that with their rhetoric about the global war party, this conspiracy theory that posits that this kind of shadowy force in the West is trying to drag Georgia as cannon fodder into the war against Russia. We see this with the accusations that the West is using NGOs and media to interfere in Georgia's internal affairs, hence the foreign agent law. And we see this in the fact that they've stopped even trying to pretend to fulfill the requirements to start accession talks to the EU. But the first point I would make on this is that moving away from Europe does not necessarily mean moving towards Russia. I don't think this is a zero-sum equation. If it ever was, it is becoming less of one in the region. This is becoming a multipolar world. The power of the US and the EU is declining, as is the power of Russia. And you see the power of Russia declining very vividly here in the Caucasus just in the last couple of years. I think in this context, it's more useful to see Georgia trying to mimic some of the regional countries that have had some success with a multi-vector foreign policy. I'm thinking of Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Hungary, all of which have adopted a transactional foreign policy with different issues siding with the West or with Russia or with China or what have you. I am not convinced that Georgia has the strategic assets to pull this off. All of these other countries, Azerbaijan has oil. Turkey is a big country in a very important geographical location. It's a NATO member. Hungary is already an EU member, so it can afford to kind of be a spoiler within the EU. Georgia doesn't have any of those things. So I think this may be a miscalculation on Georgian Dream's part, but that's, I believe, the inspiration for their kind of turn against the West that we've all seen. Secondly, second point I would make is that moving away from Europe does not mean breaking with Europe. There's, I would say, a disconnect between the rhetoric and the actions of the Georgian government over the last couple of years. The rhetoric we've all seen, and I discussed above, but the actual foreign policy actions taken by the government over the last 2+ years, they are not really the actions of a pro-Russia government. Look at every UN vote that has taken place regarding the Ukraine war. Georgia has voted with the West and with Ukraine. It seems like ancient history, but Georgia applied for and got candidate status to the EU. Now, of course, there are, I think, very legitimate questions about how serious they are at this point, but it's something that they didn't have to do. And it's something that certainly a pro-Russia government would not have done. Finally, the question of sanctions. I think this is a question that's often muddy in press reporting about Georgia, but it's been muddied, in fact, by the Georgian Dream government itself. I mean, Garibashvili, when he was prime minister, said we are not going to join the U.S. sanctions. That said, they have enforced the U.S. and European sanctions consistently, and this is something that American and European officials constantly point out. The issue is muddied a bit by the question of parallel imports and the fact that Georgia is not necessarily doing anything to stop those, but in that I would share that with almost every country in the region. A third point that I think is important to keep in mind is that just because Georgia is doing something that we don't like doesn't mean that it is doing it because they want to be close to Russia. This is something that is claimed again and again in Georgian political discourse and in the international media narrative about what's going on in Georgia, mainly in two particular categories. The first category is about their response to the Ukraine war, the lack of the the fact that they don't want to directly criticize Russia, the fact that they often do directly criticize Ukraine. This is something that people point at as evidence that they are doing Russia's bidding, for example. I think the explanation is a lot simpler. They are afraid of Russia. Georgia does not have any security guarantees from anyone, including the West. And they're in a very precarious situation. And I think this is something that something that I think Western policymakers understood about this cautious approach that they've taken. The second main category where you hear this allegation is in the many illiberal or autocratic laws that they have passed or discussed over the last 2 years. The most notorious being the foreign agent law, but also this includes the anti-LGBT law, the threat to ban the opposition parties if they come to power, if they win a constitutional majority in the election, and so on. Again, I think there's a simpler explanation of this. They are trying to stay in power, and to do this, they are trying to repress their opponents, their enemies, and at the same time appeal to a socially conservative electoral base. A fourth point to make on this point, I don't think it's actually possible to be a viable pro-Russia government in Georgia. The opinion polls, I tend to be maybe skeptical of the opinion polls showing the great support for EU membership in Georgia. I think that this is often, that this support for the EU is maybe broad but shallow. I don't know that that's the case with sentiment towards Russia. I think that the opposition to Russia in Georgia is very deep, and it cuts across ideology and generation and class and everything else. And I think it's just simply impossible to be pro-Russia in Georgia. And you see this in the fact that contrast to where in Moldova and Ukraine, or at least in pre-2022 Ukraine, you had genuine pro-Russia forces who were, openly and unambiguously pro-Russia. There are a very small number of those kind of groups in Georgia, and they're very marginal. They're very small and very marginal. I just think that the appetite for a pro-Russia politics here is nil, basically. And then the final point that I would make on this is that the message on the electoral message that the opposition has taken, that this is a referendum between Russia and the West, I don't know that this is something that is very appealing to Georgian voters, or at least is appealing to Georgian voters outside of a small, Tbilisi urban liberal electorate. Opinion polls have borne this out. When you ask Georgians what are their main concerns, economic concerns are always at the top of the list, and then kind of geopolitical concerns are much lower. I know that the opposition parties, when they campaign, they tend to put all of these economic questions in the framework of, okay, once we're in Europe, all of these questions are going to be solved. Everything will be better. We're going to get huge aid packages and so on. But I think that this sounds very abstract. And I think that too is borne out by recent research that people have been doing into political opinions here. So I guess I'll stop with that, and we'll look forward to everyone's questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Josh. Now we will turn to the ambassador.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be here. And Joshua just made quite thought-provoking remarks and did a good defense, I have to say, of the Georgian Dream. But I will have to take issue with some of the claims that have been made. These elections are characterized by being first on many levels. These are first fully proportional elections in Georgia. which means that for the first time, the ruling party does not have that majoritarian advantage. And as we know, fully proportional elections tend to favor coalitionary outcomes, at least when they are conducted in free and fair manner. It's also the first when the Georgia's ruling party is going for the fourth consecutive win. We've never had a party ruling this long. It is the first time that Georgia's foreign policy priority is being decided in these elections. Now, Georgia and Georgians and all people who are present here disagree about everything, pretty much. But there was one thing that they agreed about, and that was that Georgia had to go westwards in order to survive and guarantee its independence and sovereignty. This is no longer given, and that consensus has actually actively been undermined by the ruling party. So this is the first one that we will be deciding on the foreign policy orientation of the country. Now, foreign policy in a country like this is very closely linked to the domestic politics. Now, in Georgia, that link, that westward orientation has very much conditioned domestic democratic reforms because Georgia wanted to be part of the institutional West for, we can say, security, mainly imperative, but also sort of cultural, civilizational, etc. It was framed in those terms, but security imperative was definitely the defining. That meant that Georgia had to deliver on domestic reforms. It had to democratize. It has never been perfect, but attempts have been put in place from the beginning until recently, until this link between the foreign orientation and domestic democratization has been broken, which actually happened a few years ago, I would argue. And unlike Joshua, I actually think that this is the first most pro-Russian government we've had, at least in its current configuration. Now, Georgian Dream came to power in 2012. It was a coalition, a rather loose coalition of parties. And yes, it followed the pro-Western course. Yes, it signed association agreement. I was Georgia's ambassador in Brussels. Yes, it was under the Georgian Dream that, the constitutional obligation to do everything to promote Georgia's European and Euro-Atlantic integration was enshrined. However, what we see now is a major departure from this position that they have taken before. Moreover, it's a major transformation of this ruling party also in terms of its political identity. It started out as being center-left. It actually joined the European Party of Socialists until they were kicked out because they have gone through an amazing political migration from center-left to very far right. And when they started attending CPAC conferences and the gatherings of the conservative, I don't remember exactly how to unspell it, but the gatherings in the Budapest, that's when this was clear and finalized. So there's a huge transformation there. And it's quite amazing that they expect that having changed foreign political priorities, having changed internal party political identity, and also they started out with quite strong social policy emphasis, and having abandoned that they still expect to get the same kind of vote and the same support. Without all of this, of course, happened without direct communication with the electorate. It's just happened, and you just have to accept it. There are also now. We are talking about the Russian influence, and I don't know, because I'm not an investigative journalist, to say that everything that Georgia is doing and the Georgian Dream is doing, it is doing under Russian instructions. I have no evidence of that. But what is clear is that the outcome that we see now, the kind of democratic backsliding that we see in Georgia, and I agree with Joshua on this point, they definitely want to stay in power, except that, you know, this is not democracy. You have to accept the fact that you may lose power at least once, and then go to the opposition, and then, okay, come back. But this kind of determination to stay in power, no matter what, no matter how you have changed, no matter how contrary you are maybe to the expectations and aspirations of your people, and simply not allowing the possibility of a normal democratic change is highly undemocratic. And part of this, what is going on right now, is that you have a very unbalanced playing field. In Georgia, we will have elections, but they are structurally rigged elections. It's very similar in many ways what is going on in Hungary. Let alone Russia. You don't have any independent institutions left. You have no checks and balances. You don't have the systems that basically prevent the state from being captured. You have full control of state resources plus private resources, personal resources of the head of the ruling party. You keep changing the rules, and this is very important, right? You start changing the rules, particularly in the election code, recently changing the rules of the composition of Central Election Commission. Yes, you have proportional elections, but now you try to somehow sort of improve or change that handicap, and you introduce these delegates, etc., etc. So everything, all of this is done legally. It's done by the hands of democratically elected officials, democratically elected government, which is dismantling Georgia's democracy right now. And as I said, is also sort of breaking that link with the foreign policy. Now, we were talking, the question was about Russia's influence. And I think it's very important to think what are Russia's assets. I would say in Georgia, in terms of the influence, I would say about 5, 6, 10 years ago, they were less than they are now. And this goes in parallel with Georgia having achieved candidate status, with Georgia being probably more advanced than ever in its relations with European Union. And yet, paradoxically, our relations with the West are worst, and Russia's influence has increased. We can start with the economic leverage. I mean, Georgia, after 2008, basically all the links were severed. We signed the DCFTA with the European Union, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. And yes, we are far away. It takes special measures to make this agreement work. But instead, all the political capital was spent on restoring ties with Russia through this informal dialogue. So as a result, again, Russia became one of the major markets for Georgian produce, which means that we've basically handed the leverage that Russia did not have, softer leverage, to Moscow. Of course, there's clear security and military assets that have been there and remain, and nothing has changed in that respect. If anything, it's getting worse. I mean, Georgia's 2 regions are occupied by Russia. The military bases are stationed there. Now they're talking about constructing a naval base in Ochamchire and basically using Georgia to project power from the Black Sea and to dominate the Black Sea. The influence also is increasingly one of the assets, let's say, and the source of influence is also increasingly ideological. And that's new too. I mean, if you look at the messaging, the discourse, the ideological sort of positioning of the Georgian Dream and the Russian government today, it is extremely similar. So this is this ideology of conservatism, this collective sort of over-individual, anti-liberal. This is not just illiberal. I would say it is aggressively anti-liberal. this whole discourse of traditional values and weaponization of LGBTQ rights, I mean, yes, there is a conservative base. Was it necessary to bring this law into the discussion? Was it really Georgian children were the victims of the propaganda? Of course not. This is tool, and it is a very well-known tool by that any sort of political consultant will tell you. You have to monopolize polarization. You have to bring in these kind of wedge issues, and that helps with the electoral victory. It's an instrument. So in Georgia, where political polarization always was present, today, again, I would say in contrast to earlier years, it has become an instrument of political power. It has become an instrument of staying in power. And that is very much linked to projecting Russia's influence. And I mentioned that this kind of dismantling is taking place legally by the means of parliamentary supermajority and the Russian-style law, which is a Russian law. And of course, what is going to be, who will be the victim of this law? It's first of all civil society, and it's first of all the sense that Georgia is still a free country. Now, as I said, Georgia has never been a great democracy, and actually every government that comes to power wants to stay and never leave, and we have serious structural issues. However, Georgia still always felt like a free country, precisely because there was a space for free media, there was a space for open debate, and there was a civil society. And that is one of the major constraints on Russian influence, the societal resilience. And it's very popular to talk about democratic resilience, but if there is one a source of democratic resilience in Georgia, it's in the civil society and the public, basically. And this is that's precisely what's being targeted by this law. And the outcome will be, we know what happened in Russia after this law. Basically, any free-thinking person either had to flee or register as a foreign agent. And that's the future we're looking at. Another, and I think finally, and I will stop here, it's striking that, and I often said, and tomorrow I'll be talking and comparing the Georgian model with the Hungarian model, but I would claim now that Georgia is moving away from urbanization under the Georgian Dream and going towards Putinization, because openly this ruling party is campaigning on the authoritarian ticket. It says, we're going to ban the opposition. We're going to prosecute them. So it's instead of, yes, economic factors like in any country, economic concerns matter. So what is Georgian Dream's economic vision for the country? It's non-existent. The vision is, I'm going to come and put everyone in jail and call them foreign agents. All right, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And now we will turn to Georgi Kandelaki. Georgi.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me for this very timely discussion. Well, I also want to join Natalie in saying that I was a little bit surprised with Mr. Kutsera's defense of Georgian Dream, and I have to stress that I almost don't agree with all due respect with anything he had to say. Well, why is this election important? There are elections in many countries. Yes, Georgia is on the verge of a breakdown of the democratic system, but it's not just another election where democracy may break down. Democracies have broken down or have backslided in many different parts of the world in recent years. But this election, I believe, matters to the United States in particular, but also to the West, broadly speaking, because if things go in the wrong way, this would mean not only the deepening of the democratic backsliding or the collapse of the democratic system in Georgia, but this would also mean let's say, this would also mean a scoring of a major geopolitical victory by Russia. That's how the Russians themselves view it. And if you don't believe it, you can check 3 recent statements of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service and a personal statement by its chief, Mr. Narishkin, who said, quote, we, the Foreign Intelligence Service, we want to help Georgia, meaning Georgian government, prevent a US-backed color revolution. And there has been a consistent stream of top-level statements by highest Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Lavrov, which have consistently backed Georgian Dream. Now, there are the drift of Georgia towards the Russian orbit. It's almost undisputed in Georgia, but also, I was just in Washington at a conference, and this drift is something that is undeniable now. But some of these signs have been of the growth of Russian influence and transformation of Georgia into a Russian satellite state have been accumulating over the years. For example, the embrace of Mr. Kutsera said some of these groups are marginal, like I'm sure he meant Altinfo and some of the openly Putinist, violent extremist groups. But why would let's say so, a government that is not let's say becoming a satellite of Russia, why would such government be embracing them, or the government that previously claimed it was pro-Western? The openly Putinist forces have fully merged and fused with Georgian Dream. They have been granted, and that's already for quite some years, they have been essentially granted impunity for violence. They are getting money from Russia with, no problem at all there. They commit violence on regular basis. And there has been convincing evidence produced that some of these pogroms have been organized by Georgian Dream and these groups jointly. And maybe some foot soldiers would be arrested, but they have total impunity. None of their leaders have ever been prosecuted. The Transparency International Georgia has produced convincing evidence of how Georgian Dream government is helping them with financing. And finally, we have heard that when in earlier years, when US-Georgia relations were better, when Georgian officials would be asked why some of the leaders of these violent groups would not be prosecuted, they would say, oh, because the Russians would be upset. So why would a pro-Western government ask Russians whom to arrest and whom not? There are just so many examples. I mean, these discussions would not be enough to just list the things are publicly known that indicate Georgia's transformation into a Russian client state. For example, one of the most important recent examples is, of course, the personality of Mr. Parskhaladze, the former prosecutor general, who was sanctioned by the United States government for being, as the United States government essentially said, FSB employee, not even an agent, for pushing Russian interests in Georgia. Mr. Parskhaladze is a close confidant of Mr. Ivanishvili and remains so, and he has been basically in charge and controlling the criminal justice, prosecution, and judicial system for quite some years. And now, as we know, again, it's not my opinion, it's the United States government. He is essentially an employee of the Russian Federal Security Service. Or indeed the murder of, everybody remembers recent high-profile swap between United States, Western countries, including, of course, United States and Russia. And the swap of Mr. Krasikov, everybody remembers that. But Mr. Krasikov's victim, that's actually, his personality is quite interesting in the context of our discussion today. Mr. Hangoshvili, former Georgian security operative, as it is publicly known now, he was part of US-Georgia Security Cooperation, who was assassinated by on behalf of the Russian state, as it was found by the German court in Berlin in 2019. His story is instructive. Mr. Hangoshvili, who was instrumental in fighting both Islamic fundamentalism and Russian networks in Georgia. There was an attempt on his life in Georgia in 2015 when Russians tried to kill him in downtown Tbilisi, and the Georgian state told him, "We will not protect you." Somebody who worked loyally for the Georgian state, he was refused protection. His right to possess firearm was taken away, and he was told to leave Georgia. He left. He got killed in Berlin. And when this happened, and when this was in the news, and the German government expelled Russian diplomats and so forth, the country that said nothing about the assassination of its own citizen and a former officer of security forces was Georgia. And there too, in this case, I don't want to go on too much on Hangashvili's case, but it's an instructive case. The German federal prosecution said in the judicial proceedings that Mr. Hangashvili left Georgia because of the pro-Russian government of Georgia. And or Gavrilov's case, when Russian Communist MP was invited to chair this meeting of the Russian Front group called Interparliamentary Assembly of Orthodoxy, which is Russian influence group, a platform essentially. I may recall that Mr. Gavrilov, who is a Russian Communist MP, was previously advisor to Saddam Hussein in 1991. Why would a pro-Western government invite a former advisor of Saddam Hussein to chair a public meeting in Georgian parliament and occupy speaker's chair? So the list is very, very long, and now here we are at this brink of a possible calamity in Georgia. The possible Russian victory in Georgia would be a calamity for the Georgian people, who, as it was already mentioned, are overwhelmingly pro-Western, but that would be a blow to U.S. interests, I believe, and Western interest, who and the United States has invested in this relationship for a number of decades, and this relationship cannot just be allowed to fly away, so to speak. And I'll conclude my introductory remarks there.
Thank you, Georgi. And now we'll turn to Julie George.
Hi, thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be part of this group of people. So, as I was putting my thinking together, I was thinking about the title and the understanding that a lot of the emphasis today would be on Russia and the geopolitical narrative. And what I'd like to do is kind of explore what I think are three major narratives, one of them geopolitical, but some other narratives by which we might understand the current political moment in Georgia and kind of put the elections in terms of the meaning of that current political moment. So this is going to, well, it's going to be what it's going to be. I'm a little bit worried. I don't want to antagonize my Georgian colleagues, just given the comments. But let's start with the geopolitical moment. A lot of the geopolitical moment, got picked up by Georgi and Natalie talking about the role of Russia, and both gave voice. Natalie, more than Georgi, I think, gave voice to some of the uncertainties. There's a lot of evidence, as Georgi's pointed out, about Russian interests being played out in Georgian political space, but the exact connections and the exact nature of those connections, I think Natalie brought up quite nicely that we don't know the structure of those. I was just in Tbilisi, and in conversing with many of my colleagues, there's a great deal of different information that comes from kind of similar sort of places of fear, places of concern about what this Georgian geopolitical space is turning out to be. And especially given what appears to be a much more assertive Russian strategy vis-a-vis its near abroad, as we see in Ukraine, of course, with a full-scale invasion, and what that means for Georgia and how this election frames that Russian goal. So I think it's an important thing. I think we're going to learn a lot. And I think that there's a great deal of information that we don't know in terms of just the centralization, the level of active malevolence inside Georgian political space versus a more influential sort of metric. And I think those are some interesting things to explore. And I think that the differentiation of argumentation that we see from our panelists today kind of reflects some of those uncertainties, and certainly the urgency of them, I think, is very important. For me, though, I am taken by this notion of what it means to be pro-Western in Georgian political space. And it strikes me that this pro-Western element has always been ambivalent in terms of its fundamental substantive meaning. And what I mean by this is that geopolitically, and Natalie pointed this out, the pro-Western position has been a concern about a geopolitical position vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis security, vis-a-vis the protection of the Georgian political space, of its sovereignty, and its ability to kind of chart its own path politically, diplomatically, economically. But the West, of course, has multiple meanings. And in terms of things like EU conditionality, to be pro-Western is fundamentally a domestic element. It's a domestic component, and it has to do with things like democracy, things like democratic values, but more than democratic values, right? Democratic institutions, checks and balances, and these sorts of things. And it strikes me that even prior to the Georgian Dream position, and Natalie made this point about the structural concerns and structural flaws inside Georgian political space, this element of Georgian being pro-Western, of that Georgian moment, has always been ambiguous. And it has served the interests of Georgian ruling parties to embrace that ambiguity. And the Georgian Dream in this case is probably the most extreme example, but we can still see that example in the UNM Saakashvili regime and then the Shevardnadze regime prior to that. And so this ambivalence, this ambiguity is something that has been very politically useful for the Georgian political class to maintain authority, to kind of have not necessarily a doublespeak, but an arena of gray area and opacity that lets it pursue the interests of remaining in power. And so for me, I'm very much focused on this internal ambiguity, and I want to draw some, I think, some points on these sorts of narratives. And as I think about it, the domestic narrative, we can divide it into two spaces. And I think that some of the disagreements between Joshua and Georgi and Joshua and Natalie actually fall along these dual narrative points, which I think are quite distinct. And it could be that this is a way to kind of bridge this commentary. The first is a condition of regime type. Georgia, as we know, has never been a democratic regime. And certainly under the Georgian Dream leadership, it has become, it has engaged, as Georgi notes, in extreme democratic backsliding, and it has the contours of a standard competitive authoritarian oligarchic regime with a kleptocratic leadership that obtains loyalty and authority from its inner circle, through the abundant resources of a primary oligarch. This is just the fact, as far as I can tell. This is my analytical opinion of what the Georgian Dream Party is today, not necessarily what it was in 2012, because it was democratically elected, but what it has become today. And we see this, of course, with the EU conditionalities, right? So in 2012, the EU released the 12 priorities for Georgia, and one of them was a requirement for de-oligarchization, right? There's a major thing. I'd never heard the term, but then I learned it. And then subsequently, a year subsequent, the EU provided its 9 conditions, which still continued to include this requirement for de-oligarchization. And if you look at that, right, the oligarch they are referring to is Bidzina Ivanishvili, who created the Georgian Dream Party and is the focal point for the rents and the resources that provide the structure for the Georgian Dream Party. So what the EU is essentially doing without laying out these conditionalities and the priorities is saying, in fairly ultimatum form, that the Georgian Dream must self-immolate, because the thing that keeps it moving, the thing that keeps it intact is Ivanishvili. With concerns like that, under the Georgian Dream, it is absolutely impossible, as far as I can tell, for Georgia to join the EU, for Georgia to become democratic, because the political system relies on this oligarchic structure. So for me, as I'm looking at Georgia now in its regime formation, as opposed to voter interest, which I think are different, but in terms of its regime formation, I see no path for the Georgian Dream to achieve the EU conditionalities as they are listed. And I don't see any path for them to concede an election. Because what does the concession of that election mean? If they cannot win an electoral majority, it means they have to come to terms judicially with the repression. And the repression has become more overt in the last year. Prior to the Foreign Agents Law, the passing of the Foreign Agents Law, prior to the assembly and protests at the foreign agents law. Georgi was referring to people being assassinated, people being beaten, the Titushkebi, the groups of people who are chasing people and beating them up. All of those were in the kind of the smoke and mirrors, ambiguous condition of being unclearly linked to the central government. But now there is very clear evidence that the central government is complicit, has been complicit in these sorts of attacks. The phone calls, the graffiti, the beating, all have clear, transparent ties to the current security services. And so what that means for the Georgian Dream government is that if they concede this election, those people must face justice. And that, I think, is a condition that is antithetical to their understanding of their own empowerment. And I also think they created the precedent for attacking the opposition when they jailed Saakashvili and when they had a trial that was an abuse of prosecutorial fairness. Not to say that UNM did not commit crimes, but the mechanism by which those crimes have been prosecuted have not been pursued with an attentiveness to transparency, to justice, to a clear right given to a defendant in a trial. And because of that precedent that they themselves set, or maybe they themselves perpetuated, because perhaps the UNM also committed some of those errors in their governance, but because they were accelerated under the Georgian Dream, then the Georgian Dream must then face that precedent. And I think that precedent is probably very much not within their interest to ever want to face. And so I think what the Georgian Dream has done is they've gotten themselves in a bit of a problem. Because there's a very unclear way to electorally get out of this corner that they backed themselves into. But that's a regime thing. Let's talk about interest, because I think in this case, Joshua and I probably agree on a bit. One is that in Georgian politics, like if you look at the surveys, the Georgian Dream has obtained the plurality of support, at least from polling that has come out fairly consistently in the last 4 years. It's increased recently, and that could be due to Russian disinformation in the campaign space. It could be due to the fact that they're out campaigning in fairly dramatic ways. But nonetheless, we can see, the last poll, the 36% Edison poll gave them 36% of Georgian voters, and the rest of the opposition parties fall short of that. The opposition parties largely are competing for the same Western orientation, geopolitical orientation space, without talking about some of the regime interests, about democratization, about the various conditionalities that are provided by the EU. And I think that that I guess might be an electoral loss just politically. I think another thing to point out and to notice is that Georgia in the last 2 years has achieved unprecedented economic growth due to the war in Ukraine, in part due to the re-export of goods coming in to subvert the sanctions. For example, the automotive industry has been doing very well. I was looking at some polling, stepping away from Georgian Dream specific and stepping away from pro-Western position specific, things like elements of trust for the executive. And what you can see since the agents law have been released is that there has been in Tbilisi a decrease of trust in the executive, but in non-capital urban areas, an increase of trust in the executive. And I wonder, and I speculate just politically, whether or not there's some vested economic interests that actually like the Georgian Dream's economic position and economic standing, the European ultimatum notwithstanding. So Josh has told me that I have not so much time, so I want to just draw some quick conclusions here. If it's the case, if we going back to the original thinking about what it means to be pro-Western, if what it means to be pro-Western and what we're talking about here is geopolitical orientation, I'm thinking also, Josh, if you're in your New York Times op-ed, which I read with interest this morning, it could be, like Georgian Dream has a lot more options. They can move towards China. They can move towards Russia now. but I wonder how substantive this kind of movement actually is. It could be, given the lapse of pro-Western domestic transformation inside Georgian political space since 1991, right? It's always been in this kind of partially free condition, that the pro-Western position in Georgia, it could be fairly shallow. And what that means is also its pro-Russian condition is also likely fairly shallow. Russia is a terrible partner. Just ask the Armenians. It has been extraordinarily destabilizing in the Caucasus. In Central Asia, it can't get Uzbekistan to join its union. So I think that for those countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus and the near abroad, the idea of a long-term dependency on Russia, setting the West aside, is a fairly uncertain path to follow. And so it could be that we're observing is, instead of something very deeply pro-Western, is a shifting geopolitical orientation that is the nature of any country or set of countries that are, find themselves wedged between these major powers, regional powers, whose power and position internationally waxes and wanes, and then they have to pivot back and forth. I think Alex Cooley's written books on this, and so that I think that's one way to think of it. I don't think that Russia, as Georgia becomes less pro-Western, it may not become reliably in pro-Russian in any sort of entrenched way. And I think when this is my final point, because I know I'm out of time, it all might be moot. I've been fascinated by Georgian politics. I find it very interesting that the Georgian Dream is campaigning to the extent that it is using these resources. It looks like it actually wants to win an election. And that's a very interesting thing for a regime that can fix the election. I don't think, however, it will permit itself to lose. So I'm just going to leave myself there. And thank you guys very much for your attention.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for those remarks. And we're right on schedule. We have about a half an hour now for Q&A. I'd like to invite the audience as well to leave questions in the Q&A. We don't have any in there now. That's fine. Elise and I and Sasha have plenty of questions for our panelists. But if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. Same thing in the chat on YouTube. I want to ask a general question on the basis of the remarks that we've gotten here. One thing that's come out of this discussion is just how much is at stake in this particular election. But I was wondering if you could share with the audience, I mean, we often hear that's the case when you have a party that is in power that might be replaced by power. But what we've heard throughout this talk here is what's at stake if Georgia Dream wins the election, despite the fact, as Ambassador Savanazi mentioned, Georgia Dream has been in power for a great deal of time at this point right now. So I wondered if you could just dig into, and maybe that we don't need answers from everybody, and maybe we want to have different takes on this, why this election is so important. Is it about getting a larger majority in the parliament and being able to change the constitution? That's kind of the Hungarian playbook a bit. Is it about running, picking up on Julie's point a second ago, that they're sort of actively running in this election? Is it about a different type of mandate, that the campaign is being run on something? But if we wake up and Georgia Dream has won the election a couple of months out from now, why is that going to be different than a couple of months ago? Or is there a sense that this is seen as sort of a watershed moment for the opposition? I'm just trying to draw out why winning this election, if it doesn't lead to a change in who's in power, is so consequential for the future of Georgia. And I'll throw that out to anyone who wants to answer that. Georgi, yeah, if you want to go first, and then Ambassador Zavanazi.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I mean, how many campaigns can you recall in which the ruling party's promise, the key promise, would be to outlaw opposition? It's just astounding that that's what their promise actually is. So what we're talking here is not just possible deepening of backsliding, but we're talking about breakdown of democracy. And again, they say so. It's their promise, on the record pledge, is to outlaw and prosecute. May I remind you that the promise of Mr. Ivanishvili is to prosecute, to hold Nuremberg trials for collective UNM, by which basically means dissent, both political opposition, but also civil society, to prosecute entire opposition and civil society. And he has I know that they talk with the diplomats and some of our partners is that it's just an election rhetoric. But Mr. Ivanishvili has a very solid track record of actually doing what he says. So that's why it's consequential. Either the democracy in Georgia breaks down definitively, or Georgia manages to pull a second change of government through elections and consolidate its democracy. As we know from theory of democratization, for a society to be considered sort of full-fledged democracy, you need for this change to happen twice. And here, the Georgian society has a unique chance. So if to do that. So if some people in Washington or Brussels believe that Mr. Ivanishvili will not pull off Lukashenko, he will. He will. And our objective is not for this to happen, and then for us to say that our prediction was correct. Our objective is for this not to happen. And I think it is very important in the run-up to election. Very little time remains, but in the run-up to elections, it's critically important to cool some hotheads, cool it down in Georgian Dream, because we know that they are considering some extreme scenarios, let's say, and these scenarios are in nobody's interest. So,
Georgi, I just want to push you on one thing, because I'm not denying that, and my question wasn't intended to deny that any of these things aren't enormously consequential, all the things we've talked about. I guess my question is more, I've seen lots of times with this playbook, where you go to outlaw the opposition party, you do it before the election, not after the election. So given that Georgia Dream is in power now, I guess what I'm trying to draw up for the audience is like, what is it about having this election take place that would allow these kinds of more draconian policies that you're describing to be implemented post-election, but they haven't been able to be implemented, but they haven't been implemented pre-election. So that's the point I'm trying to draw out here so that people can understand that.
All right. Okay, I understand. So it has several explanations, I think, not one. One explanation would be that Mr. Ivanishvili has made a conscientious decision to bet on Russia's victory in Ukraine. That would be one. He thinks that the Ukrainian, he thinks that Russians are going to prevail, but he made a consequential decision. Why he made that? What is his motive? We don't know. We cannot speculate what's going on in his mind. We can only judge by the actions that he has taken. I believe, as I said, that these actions and statements also were indicative of this trajectory from early on, and unfortunately, they were missed. Many other things in Washington in particular, many things were happening in the world, and Georgia's drift was overlooked by US bureaucracy, and the political guidance over the Georgian file in both Washington and Brussels thinned or disappeared over the years. So the bureaucracy, with all respect to it and the importance of the US support for Georgia, didn't really handle or appreciate or recognize the fundamental shift that Ivanishvili indicated. But now he made this choice, and here we are facing this decision. And I think it is in the interest of course, Georgian society. As I said, it would be calamity for Georgia if this disaster happens. But it is in everybody's interest to cool things down and to allow Georgian society to make its choice. Now, and one small note on polling. Julie mentioned that Georgian Dream has plurality. Well, there are quite a few credible polling that shows that Georgian Dream is unable to form a government. As Natalie mentioned in the very beginning, this is the first election since 1992, perhaps, in which we have fully proportional elections. Georgia used to have fully proportional elections 100 years ago, independent, democratic, and internationally recognized Georgia, which Soviet Russia occupied and then staged a bloodbath there. And I regret we didn't have time to touch upon these issues. But now we have fully proportional elections. So the fora of majoritarian MPs, Georgian Dream doesn't have. If there were majoritarians today, then they would have a serious chance. They would to secure formation of government. But now it is, even if they pull manipulation of several percentage points, which is what we know is their intent to employ this diverse menu of manipulations, like the voter suppression, like taking away people's IDs, and the so-called carousels, so-called controlled voting. and many of the things of which there's plenty of evidence from the previous election. But nevertheless, even with that, they face great deal of difficulty in securing. One other explanation I forgot to mention is that with this crazy rhetoric, and they have a problem of overreach, they are also trying to consolidate their base. And also, it's quite interestingly, they are trying to absorb the sort of the pro-Russian vote, the openly pro-Russian or the let's say full-fledged pro-Russian vote. They are trying to fully absorb. The openly Putinist forces are essentially having no campaign right now because of this proportional election. Georgian Dream needs their votes 100%, and that would be a partial explanation, not full again.
Okay. Thanks very much. Ambassador Sabanadze, if you want to take a crack at answering this question, what is it about the election that changed things? And we have a question from Kate Smirnoff in the audience saying, why do you think they are campaigning if they can rig the election? And if that's part of your answer, that's great. If not, we can toss that out later.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, I have to leave, so I will try to answer sort of comprehensively. So what will happen if Georgian Dream stays in power? And there are obviously chances of this happening. Firstly, and I will go back, why are they campaigning and why are they even holding elections and so on? I mean, every autocratic ruler is holding elections. I mean, that's a source of some kind of legitimacy, right? But Georgian Dream regime, let's say, it is competitive authoritarian. So the competitive nature is important, and it really fits well into that description. And as I said, they are in a slightly disadvantaged position now with the proportional elections. So they have to compete, and that's part of where they have come. Now, another point is that the kind of democratic backsliding that we are talking about, Georgia is not an exception, okay? It's part of the trend. And it is happening in many countries, including in Central Europe. It is a gradual process. It is incremental. It is very rare that today you see democracies collapsing by coup d'etat or tanks being rolled through the streets. It happens in this way. So bit by bit. So you take one, you get rid of one head of independent institution and call it a reform. You do something else. You call it like a transformation. You can even manipulate EU conditionality, and actually Julie mentioned de-oligarchization, and it's very interesting what Georgian Dream did in response to de-oligarchization requirement. They came out with a law, the draft, then it was dropped because it was basically buried by the Venice Commission and the EU. But the law, the way they turned it is that they used the oligarchization basically to create an instrument of repression and linking and allowing prime minister to decide who is an oligarch and how that person can enter into politics or not. I mean, the draft law was amazing. Even the other sort of number one requirement in the EU conditionality, which is depolarization, that has also been instrumentalized and said, if you want depolarization, let's get rid of opposition. That way, I'm fulfilling the requirement of the EU. So it's quite interesting how skillfully they can manipulate these things while maintaining the facade of the EU integration, simply because it is the demand of the population. What is the basis of it? How profound it is, what it really means, that's a separate question. But in polls, and including among the Georgian Dream voters, the EU integration is high on the agenda. So they cannot just turn around and say, let's forget about it because it's problematic. However, if they stay in power, as Julie said, they will not progress on the EU integration path. They will keep the rhetoric, but they simply cannot, because that means to self-destruct. That basically means to fulfill all these conditions, means to completely change the regime type that they have built, which obviously they will not want to do. And what is interesting, what Joshua was describing, the kind of the regional multipolarity that is happening in the South Caucasus, that is definitely an enabling factor in this, because Georgian Dream can maintain that it is still pursuing European integration. It even tells this to the neighbors, but at the same time to pursue the kind of multi-alignment which is becoming a norm in the region. And this sort of multipolarity, I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, but it is a very risky business for Georgia. It is true that the cost for Georgia of pursuing sort of stubbornly Western integration were high. But today, for the first time, there is actually a real opportunity. It was never there before. So to turn away from it and to start courting with multi-alignment is a bit counterintuitive, to put it mildly. But it is an enabling situation. So actually, and here again, I also agree with Joshua that Russian influence might be diminished in the South Caucasus under the constraints of this war. However, this does not mean that the Western influence is growing. The Western is becoming the sort of one of the many alternatives. So Georgian government with this configuration, what they will do is, yes, they will continue courting China. Yes, they will do also with Iran and Turkey, because they are the powers in the region, right? And might be also at the expense of the West. So the turn actually may not be necessarily, oh, we're going to now join the Eurasian Economic Union, but they will take an anti-Western position if that suits their interests, and particularly if this suits personal interests of Bidzina Ivanishvili. So I would not be surprised that if they stay in power, for instance, the elections and the conduct, they don't, it doesn't go as smoothly as expected, and there are sanctions applied. We will see Georgia sort of drifting in this, joining the club of those who want de-dollarization, maybe BRICS, maybe something else, sort of taking the country away from what has been before really the aspiration to be in a different club. Basically, Georgia before had, I often called it like a misplaced nation syndrome, because, it was in the South Caucasus, but actually wanted to be somewhere further west. And now you see these changes. And finally, this has dramatic consequences for the governance type in Georgia. I mean, for me, pursuing European integration matters primarily because that, for me, is a guarantee of democratic rule. Multipolarity is not conducive to democratization. To the contrary, democracy becomes a liability. So this will be, in my view, a deteriorating situation for people who have higher expectations for the future and different values and sort of different conception of democratic security as opposed to kind of more stable maybe, but autocratic security.
Thank you so much.
And I apologize, I have to run.
Yeah, I was going to tell everyone, Ambassador Savanazi was gracious enough to join us while she's at another conference right now in a break from the conference. So we thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. I'm going to pass the next question I'm going to pass over to Sasha Shpitalnik, who is the program director at the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and the person who makes the Jordan Center run. Sasha also has been doing her own research in Georgia, and I want to pass along to her to ask the next question.
Sure. Thanks so much. This has been such a wonderful panel. Thanks so much to all of you. I was curious to hear a little bit more about the public opinion surrounding the election, leading up to the election. And I was wondering if, and I think like this could go out to all of you, if we could speak a little bit, if any of you could speak a little bit more about the sort of urban versus rural divides and opinions leading up to the election. And Julie, you touched on this a bit. How might opposition campaigning versus Georgian Dream campaigning in rural areas differ? Has the Georgian Dream campaigning that many of you have spoken about up to this point had some effect in shoring up support, specifically the campaigning that seems to be going on pretty heavily in Tbilisi? I know there was a rally today, and there were rallies at the time of the foreign agent law protests. Have those rallies had any effect, and how might those effects differ from what the campaign efforts have been in rural areas? Thanks so much.
Maybe we can go first to Josh and then Julie on this. Josh? You're muted.
Sure. Yeah. So I think my impression is the Georgian Dream is much, much more active in campaigning in the regions that rather than rather than in Tbilisi. The Georgian Dream just has a lot more resources. If you're in Tbilisi, I would say 90% of the signs and ads and so on that you see are Georgian Dream. Maybe 8% are the Lalo Strong Georgia Coalition, and then 2% are Girchi or something. And if you go to the regions, they're 100% Georgian Dream. You see absolutely no advertising. From what I understand, rallies are very, I did a story recently on opposition campaigning in the rural areas, and it was hard to find one to cover. Whereas I think Georgian Dream just has a lot more resources, and they can have rallies all over, and they are having rallies all over. In terms of public opinion polls, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I know that the differences are pretty striking in terms of the urban versus rural voters, or specifically Tbilisi versus rural voters, in terms of trust in the current government. Rural voters have a much higher trust in the current government than Tbilisi voters. Things like that. That's a fairly clear. It's not like it's not a massive black and white divide, but it's a definite statistical significance there.
Georgi also has to leave a little early. So Georgi, do you want to go next? And then we'll go to Julie.
Yes, thank you. So I'll try to answer that quickly, and also one very small note, and I apologize, I need to run. So on the polling, some of the things that have been said are accurate. Of course, we can look in the open data on the donations to parties, and the open data shows that the Georgian Dream has overwhelming advantage in terms of in terms of businesses donating to it, and quite impressive body of evidence has been produced by watchdogs, which now face shutdown because of the Russian Foreign Agents law on how the system of kickbacks and what kind of practices have been brought to Georgian reality. I think the rural population is less immune to this flood, this tsunami of propaganda, especially on the so-called second front, and that there is this Western conspiracy to coerce Georgia into attacking Russia. There also the synchronization between Georgian and Russian governments has been very overwhelming and very, let's say, obvious, astonishing, if you ask me, how harmoniously coordinated these statements of accusing the so-called global war party, that is the United States and the European Union, of forcing Georgia to start war against Russia, how harmonious this coordination has been, so that has not to be discounted. And everyone, probably some of you have seen these crazy billboards, say no to war and choose peace, with weaponization of the war in Ukraine, using this disaster in Ukraine and the Russian aggression and attacking Ukraine. The Georgian Dream rhetoric on Ukraine from the day one of the invasion has been one, but certainly not the only indication of this drift of Georgia towards the Russian orbit. And finally, and I regret we didn't have time to discuss that, which is something I work on right now, and something that I believe has unfolded under the radar, this symptom of weaponization of Soviet totalitarian memory on Georgia, and particularly the resurgence of the image of Stalin as a symptom of this broader erosion. Since Georgian Dream came to power, we have 12 new statues of Stalin across Georgia, all of them. There is credible polling also, not so much, but still, nevertheless, there is some polling that shows that it's on the rise. For example, there is a poll that says that, and again, Stalin is sold to the Georgian society as a Georgian patriotic symbol. Not as a sort of Soviet symbol, but as a Georgian, as somebody of whom Georgian patriots should be proud. So Stalin is used as some kind of propaganda gateway. He has name recognition, and through Stalin, this contemporary disinformation, this poison of portraying the West as a threat, can be brought to the broader society. I mean, the long-term objective of Russian disinformation in Georgia has been to cultivate certain anti-Western, ethno-religious, chauvinistic nationalism or nativism in which the Western civilization is a threat and the Russian world is salvation. And will all become gays, to overstretch the argument a little bit. And there, Stalin is a figure that brings this whole system together. And for example, there is a poll, a recent poll, which showed a 12% uptick amongst those who believe that Georgian culture was better protected in the Soviet period, which means that, so it's around 36% now. So 12% increase in 1 year, which means that it is under threat. Now. There are other polls that show the resurgence of the image of Stalin. Also, probably some of you remember the drama in January this year when an icon glorifying Joseph Stalin was discovered in the Holy Trinity Cathedral of Tbilisi. And after that, our organization, Sovlab, was attacked by Speaker of Parliament for, quote, trying to discredit Christmas, as he said, because we found it on the eve of Orthodox Christmas. And so this has been something, that has been sort of brewing under the surface. And we believe the weaponization of Soviet totalitarian memory in general is a subject that has merit beyond, beyond Georgia. And one incredibly important symptom, also not so much noticed outside Georgia, has been the question of access to Soviet-era archives. The Georgian Dream has been cracking down on access to Soviet-era archives step by step over the years, introducing draconian restrictions. I mean, independent Georgia, or the government of an independent Georgia, disregarding who is in power, should have vested interest in exposing crimes of Soviet totalitarianism and crimes of communism. The practice of Georgian Dream has been the opposite. And all of that culminated in the last year. It's been a year already since the two most important archives in Georgia, the former KGB archive and the former Communist Party Central Committee archive, have been completely shut. It is easier to work in Soviet-era archives in Russia today than in Georgia. And last week, the European Parliament included this question in its resolution. And I'm very happy that we managed, as the Soviet Past Research Laboratory, to sign a memorandum with three opposition blocs on what has to be done in this question following the elections, when the government changes to establish, based on the East European and German experience, the Institute of National Memory that would deal with openness of archives, lustration. We have to do it with a 30-year delay, open archives and make it public who cooperated with the Soviet totalitarian and repressive terror machine, and also to protect and research sites of memory, such as mass graves of Soviet terror. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgi. And we understand if you have to leave. And actually, a lot of your most recent answer addressed another question that just appeared in the Q&A. So if you have to leave, we just want to thank you for participating.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good luck to you and to Georgia. Now I'd like to read a question by Stefan Shved. I wonder if we can unpack the Russian influence a little. What level of agency does Russia have versus how much of what soft or competitive autocrats do is simply confluent with what Putin does? For example, Poland under the PIS was moving in the direction of competitive authoritarianism whilst remaining staunchly anti-Russian. Thank you for a great panel. So why don't we start with you, Julie? You can answer the previous question as well as Stefan's question.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to answer both of the questions in the Q&A. So that there was Kate's question, Smirnov's question about why would they campaign if they can rig the election, and then Stefan's question about Russian influence. And it strikes me that my answer to both of these questions is the same thing, even though the questions are quite different. And that is, I think the Georgian Dream Party is very, very actually divided. Where the Russian influence hits probably is differentiated based on those divisions inside the Georgian Dream Party. There are a lot of reasons to think that there are solid collaborative relationships, for example, between the Georgian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, and that these churches both have very considerable political access to the ruling parties in both their respective countries, and serve as a kind of conduit of communication between those countries. And so I think that is an important thing to observe. There are tons of rumors that circulate in Georgian political space that are very, very hard to provide or understand evidence for, that speak to the Russian influence, and that speak also to the effect of kind of Russian propaganda, disinformation, or threats. And with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, what might be understood as a disinformation in one context might be actually a credible threat in another context, right? In terms of what would happen if the Georgians elected a government that would be independent from political Russia, right? We saw what happened in Ukraine, and it could be that we understand the full-scale invasion and also, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass events as a punishment of Ukrainian independence. And if we see that as a factor, then Russian commentary about, so-called American planned colored revolutions, as much as we know that those actually are not things, and to my knowledge, they actually aren't things, nonetheless might be something more than just propaganda and language. It could be a threat. And I'm mindful there was an interesting poll. CRC did a poll last year about perception of foreign threats in Georgia, and it's a very interesting poll. I mean, notably, it was published in 2023, so before a lot of course, this year's politics happened. There was a question: could Ukraine have avoided the war in Russia in case of a compromise? This is a poll done in Georgia. And in that case, 46%, that was a plurality vote. Most people said that no, Ukraine could not have avoided a war in Russia in case of a compromise. Was there some kind of compromise solution? And then they ask a follow-up question: can Georgia avoid a war with Russia in the case of compromise? There you have a split. About a third of the answer said yes, Georgians could compromise with Russia and avoid an intervention. That was the plurality position that got the most answers. 22% said no, there's nothing Georgia can do, and 23% said this isn't a thing, it's not a threat, right? So Georgia itself is uncertain as to what the Russian position is vis-a-vis Georgia, vis-a-vis an independent action. And I think that's an important thing to observe, is the amount of uncertainty. There is so much gained in ambiguity. But I think also the Georgian Dream's position is itself ambiguous. I think that's why we see campaigning when they have an extraordinary power over their over administrative resources, and as Natalie pointed out, over the rules of the electoral observation, about counting the votes, all of those sorts of things. I think that division reflects the fact that my guess is that the majority of people in the Georgian Dream support Western democracy, Western style democracy, and the conditionality of what is required by the EU. But I think they have a very hard time because they have an oligarch that does not share those values, and is actively working against them. And I think that's why we see so much back and forth on policy and rhetoric coming out of the Georgian Dream.
Thanks for that provocative last remark, Julie. Joshua, do you want to take the final word here? And feel free to respond to this particular question, or if other questions that have been raised earlier. We have a couple more minutes left, and then Elise will take us out.
Sure. I mean, I think to the question of why would they campaign when they can rig the election, I'm not sure that they can rig the election in terms of like stuffing ballot boxes. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I've been trying to read up on this, and my understanding is that the election system is fairly robust, and the election monitoring system is fairly robust, and that you can't just falsify a result. I think what the greater danger is, and this is wild speculation, but it's very hard for me to believe that Georgian Dream would step down voluntarily. And so then what happens if the results show that the opposition wins? And this is the wild speculation part. My guess is that they can maybe come up with some pretext about why the election was illegitimate, or something, or some kind of I don't know. That I think is the danger, rather than, and I think that requires an election to happen. I don't think they can just fix the results ahead of time. In terms of the question of the levers or the mechanisms, or I don't remember the word that was used in terms of what Russia has. I mean, I think it's, to go back to my original comments, I think we've had Georgian Dream in power for 12 years. And for all of that time, there have been people saying this is a Russian puppet government. And you have had investigative journalists, people with great interests in digging out, okay, what are the links between this government and the Russian government? And there just hasn't been any. So I think that, you saw, for example, what happened in Moldova this weekend. There were allegations that of a big vote buying scheme by Russia using Russian proxies in Moldova. That kind of thing simply isn't possible in Georgia. There is no such proxy in Georgia. And so, so the actual, and I think Poland is an instructive example of how you can have this kind of authoritarian, illiberal government and be anti-Russian. I don't, and it's not just that's a good example because it's in the post-communist space, but this is something that's happening all over the world. It's happening in, Latin America, and it's happening in India, and it's happening in America, of course. And you don't need Russia for this. So I just think that Russia in these cases serves as more of a symbol or a kind of descriptor rather than as a literal thing. And I guess finally, as the last point, I mean, it's unfortunate that Georgi and Natalie both left, but they both said that I was defending Georgian Dream, which is not the case. This is an autocratic, homophobic, paranoid government that does not deserve defense. It's just that when you're talking about them, we need to understand the nature of what they're about, rather than to understand the threat that they pose properly. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Joshua. So this was a really fascinating panel, and I just want to thank each of our speakers, Julie, Joshua, Georgi, and Natalie, for participating and sharing their insights with us today. And I would like to thank the audience for coming and remind you to keep a lookout for our next event on November 18th by checking the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center emails or website. With that, I would finally like to thank Sasha and Eileen for helping us to organize this fantastic panel, and Josh Tucker for moderating and hosting. So thanks again, and good luck to all of you with your work and your research on Georgia.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.